lying is always wrong. I think, what we don't like about lying is not the telling of falsehoods. First of all, you can lie without telling any falsehoods. You can deceive a person and be insincere without telling any falsehoods, right? I mean, there are white lies and then there are black truths. I can lie to you. I can paint a false picture by simply telling you a string of carefully selected truths.
Well, I had to tell a false picture there, I'll tell you.
Yeah. So and I can even tell you a lie. I can lie to you by telling you all the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. How? I just have to think it's false. If I think I'm telling you, if I say, there's coffee in this cup, right, but I believe it's tea, and I give it to you and you drink it, and it turns out to be coffee, I just told you a truth, but I still lied to you. I was still trying to deceive you. So, I mean, what's wrong with lying is not the telling the falsehoods even. It's the insincerity. And it's not even just the insincerity, it's the purposes to which we put the insincerity. So, I mean, if you've ever had all of your friends lie to you all day long, collude together to get you to a birthday party, to throw a surprise party. They lie, all of your friends lie to you all day long. And at the end of having been lied to by all your friends in concert, you will feel nothing but gratitude towards them. Why? Not because they deceived you, not because they were insincere. They were all insincere, but they were insincere in your interests, right? In other words, it conduced to your well-being, right? So even a lie, I think, and just, flat out complete insincerity, colluding with your friends, trying to make you believe a vast set of falsehoods for the purposes of throwing you a fantastic party, because it's in your interest now, I think turns that from a pernicious lie into more than a white lie, really a wonderful gesture of affection. So I don't believe in hard and fast rules about things like never lie, never kill.
Ozzy, can I interrupt you just for a moment? When you started talking about lying, I thought you were describing the church. Were you not?
No.
Okay.
No,
okay. I thought it was back in church just for a moment, and it just I was shaking. I said, "Wow, is he going to give an altar call or what?" I mean, come on. This topic of morality, it's all over the place. And tonight I would like an extremely coherent, that is, explanation as to what morality is. I would like for you guys to put this evolutionary structure of morality together for us. I mean, we need some clarity. We need something that people will say, wow, I want to spend the next 2 to 3 years not studying after the order of Saitian Bruggencate, but after the order of an Ozzy, a Stephen, a Bob Graves. So why don't you get the ball rolling a little bit, Ozzy?
Okay, boy.
No pressure. I mean,
no pressure.
Just take it easy, but this has to be golden.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I was very interested in the conversation that went on last week between Bob and Stephen, and it was interesting and it was frustrating. So I had all kinds of thoughts at the time. I was almost inclined to take notes, except that I was out and about listening to it as a kind of podcast, so I couldn't take notes, but I almost wish I had. I don't have a succinct summary of what morality is, because I think the subject of morality is fairly complicated, and the scope of this domain of discourse and inquiry is ill-defined. I think it's important to keep in mind that philosophical questions like this don't have a narrow scope, right? When something falls out of the domain of philosophy and falls into a chapter of science, it's usually because the questions and the problems have been cashed out in such a way that they will admit of an answer. A technology, a decision procedure, some kind of methodology has been devised that allows that area of discourse to admit of an answer. Right? There's a program of research. Okay? Every question that we have, every big, deep question that we have, whether it's the meaning of life or morality, or what should we value, or what is beautiful, what is truth, what is knowledge, everything that remains one of these questions that lacks a program and a methodology is what we call a philosophical question. right? It does not fall into a compartment, into a chapter, into a department in a university. It's this, philosophy is the repository of questions we don't know yet how to answer. We don't know where to begin, right? So I don't think it makes a lot of sense to insist that one should have a thesis statement that one starts off with to explain what morality is, right? But there is something that motivates the question, right? We do, in fact, go around making distinctions between certain kinds of actions. We regard certain kinds of people and certain kinds of actions as good or bad. We use words like good or bad. I think really the way to start into all of this is through language. Listen to how people talk. Pay very close attention to how people talk. Note the distinctions that they make, right? Note the attitudes that they have towards what it is they're talking about. So we use words like good and bad, and good and evil, and right and wrong, and should and must and mustn't, and obligation and duty, and things like that. And what do we seem to be concerned with when we're talking about that? Well, we seem to be concerned with people's actions. We're concerned with their behavior, and we take into account the consequences of their actions. But we don't just stop there. We're taking into account the intentions behind their actions, right? So we're not just narrow consequentialists. We're not just looking to see what the consequences are for us or for broader society or for some specific group of people. We're interested in the consequences of certain actions, but we take into account things like intentions. So morality, as I see it, is a domain of inquiry that is trying to figure out which actions properly belong under the heading of right and wrong. So it's primarily about actions by agents. Okay, and what is an agent? Well, an agent is a sentient being capable of deliberating between different courses of action. Okay, so we are concerned with actions that have effects on beings that can be conscious, that have felt mental experiences. We're not concerned about the welfare or the well-being of rocks, for instance, right? We don't care about that. If we discovered tomorrow that rocks, when you step on them, feel exquisite pain, they would become objects of moral concern, right? But they aren't right now. I can mow my lawn, I can rake the leaves in my backyard as Bob was doing. We're not terribly concerned about the welfare of the leaves. The leaves don't enter into our moral concern. They are not seen as objects of moral concern. And there's a reason for that. It's not arbitrary. Because as far as we can tell, leaves and blades of grass and rocks don't have any mental experiences. There's nothing that it's like to be a leaf or a rock or a blade of grass. So nothing affects its well-being in that respect. Okay. So it can't suffer. Okay. And it can't be, its mental states can't be improved or augmented. Okay, so I think that we have some concept already of what is an object of moral concern. It's the kind of thing that it's a thing to be like. There's nothing that it's like to be a rock, but there's something that it's like to be Ozzy. There's something that it's like to be a 2-year-old. There's something that it's like to be a cat or a dog, right? And so they become objects of moral concern. And depending on the scope and limits and nature of their mental experiences, they can be more or less objects of concern. That is, the degree to which they are objects of concern can change, can be higher or lower. Okay, and then but not everything that is an object of moral concern is necessarily an agent. I think we are all objects of moral concern because there's something that's like to be us, and we have mental states and we can have mental experiences, but we are agents. We're not just objects of moral concern. We're not just sentient beings who can suffer. We are able to deliberate between different courses of action, right? Young infants, we think, are objects of moral concern, but we don't really think of them as moral agents. Why not? Well, they're certainly physical agents. They're mental agents. They're able to make some decisions and act and stuff like that, but they're not able to apprehend the consequences of their own actions on the well-being and the mental states of other beings. And so we say, well, they're not responsible, right? We don't hold babies accountable, right, for their actions, okay? And it's because we understand that though they are objects of moral concern, they're not quite agents yet. They don't have the cognitive capacities yet. So I think that the moral discourse is that area of human discourse that concerns itself with objects of moral concern and how agents act in ways that are relevant to those objects of moral concern. And then it's a matter of trying to figure out what are the variables that are relevant in how we decide whether something belongs under the heading of right or wrong. And then it's very dicey. And whether or not these questions have true and false answers. I mean, there are some people who think that these questions can never be answered. Right? There's no objectivity here. It's just a matter of preferences. Right? That's a view that I would reject. Right? But I can understand why people would be inclined to that, because people disagree so much about how we ought to proceed and what is of value and so forth. But I think that there are objective answers to these questions. It's just that it's very, very hard to drill down and figure out what they are. We're not in possession of all the relevant facts about what the intentions are, of what the predictable consequences of an action are, and so forth, and how they will conduce to the well-being or harm of another object of moral concern. But I think that there are answers to this. It's just that we are right now epistemically somewhat limited, very much limited in understanding all the relevant variables in what makes an action right or wrong. But we can, I think, begin to figure out what properly belongs under the heading of right and wrong, even if in practicality we can't always do it. Just as in physics, we can often figure out what a body ought to be doing in space and how it ought to be moving, and yet we might not have all of the relevant data to predict everything, right? Like a three-body problem or something like that. There might be variables that we simply cannot get a hold of and factor into our analysis. Nevertheless, we can still have a good explanatory model that is very hard to put into application. And I think a mistake that happens here is very often people say the difficulty of putting any particular theory of morality into application means that there's just no domain of discourse worth talking about here, that it's all just made up, it's just all meaningless talk, or it's all just a matter of preferences. There's no there's no domain of facticity or veracity. There are no right and wrong answers. And I think that's a mistake. I think there are right and wrong answers to moral questions. But I think one has to be very, very tentative and provisional when one puts forward those answers, and one can't just go strictly on one's gut and what values one has drunk in from one's society. One actually has to try to scrutinize them and arrive at some reflective equilibrium.
If we were going to talk about, and we did frame this show as the evolutionary structure of morality, where would we start, that is, in the conversation, Ozzy, when it comes to the evolutionary structure of, quote-unquote, morality?
Well, in my view, you have to start with the fact that we are the creatures that we are. You have to understand humans as social creatures that arose in small groups between 70 and 300 people, right? And consequently, our ancestors in the environment of evolutionary adaptation hundreds of thousands and millions of years ago would have lived in different circumstances than we did today. And whatever selective pressures were operative then might no longer be operative now. Nevertheless, we're the creatures that we are. We live today with the kind of pro-social emotions and pro-social instincts that would have been conducive to survival for our ancestors. And some of those might be quite maladaptive, right? So, for instance, you'll hear a lot of talk about, empathy and the role of empathy in moral conduct and moral reasoning. And a lot of people are sort of very optimistic. I think they have a very, very facile theory of morality and say, well, we don't need a God, we don't need rules, we don't need to do any moral philosophy, we don't need to do any science and study evolutionary psychology or anything like that, or psychology in general. All we need to do is just rely on, human capacity for empathy and the fact that we have mirror neurons and that sort of thing. That I think is hopelessly naive, because natural selection, I think, has given us things like a capacity for empathy, and that's going to be realized through various neural architectures, right, including things like mirror neurons, but not exclusively that. But it's also given us a lot of other things. It's given us a grab bag of dispositions and pro-social and also anti-social instincts. It's given us xenophobia. I think that the tendency to divide people into in-group and out-group, us and them, right, othering and that sort of stuff, I think it's very natural. I think xenophobia is hardwired into us. And it's very dangerous, and it's something that we have to rein in. It's something that might have been extremely advantageous to our ancestors who lived in small villages, groups and tribes and things like that, little clans. That might have been terribly advantageous to them, but not so much anymore when we live in tribes of millions, largely anonymously, living with strangers all the time. Has different liabilities now. So I think that where evolution is concerned, we have to look back at the kinds of creatures that our ancestors were and understand that we are living with the same brains that they had and relatively similar bodies. But we find ourselves in completely different circumstances now. And so now, knowing something about our biology and our presumed evolutionary psychology and the different circumstances, environmental circumstances that we find ourselves in, we need to figure out what our actual interests are. We need to understand what our interests are. And I don't mean what we're interested in. I mean what is biologically in our interests, right? And from there, figure out what our needs are, and from there, figure out what our wants are and our secondary wants and so forth. And then from that, try to confect a system of principles, of rules of thumb, not hard laws and commandments and strict do's and don'ts, but principles and rules of thumb that are consistent with our evolutionary psychology, our moral psychology, and will conduce to the well-being that we want, given the kinds of creatures that we are. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of moral philosophy arose in a context that was utterly ignorant of evolutionary history. And so the theorizing that went on was not constrained by an understanding of the kinds of creatures that we are. And so it posited that we're a little less than angels sometimes. And so you get a lot of beautiful system building, like, Kant, for instance, right? And I don't think that that's a very realistic deontological system to proceed with. And then you have utilitarian systems that imagine that we are just sort of rational means and ends calculators that are always acting in our own selfish, individualistic, rational best interest. And I don't think that makes a lot of sense either, right? So I think where evolution is concerned, and the role that it has to play in moral philosophy, it has to be, I think moral philosophy nowadays has to start with an understanding of who our ancestors were, and with equal emphasis on the kind of world we have created for ourselves. We are not built for the world that we built for ourselves. That's an unfortunate fact, and it creates all kinds of problems. It puts us into moral quandaries that our ancestors would not have faced. And so we don't have an evolved moral psychology for much of the circumstances that we find ourselves in. But everything that we do come up with has to at least be consistent with our nature. If it works against our nature, it's not going to work. People aren't going to want it. And so it's going to fail.
When people come to me, they quote all kinds of scripture, okay, passage after passage. Someone can even come up to me and quote part of the Greek text. They can say, "Dekauthintes unik pisteos." I mean, there's a difference, certainly, between those people who, read a book and parrot the text than those who can actually exegete it. And so what I'm looking for is more of an exegesis, namely of what is written about this topic, what is being talked about concerning evolutionary morality or the structure of morality. And so I think you are starting to get into the details. I think you're drilling down quite a bit here. I'm looking for something past the surface. I want something more exegetical. If someone asked me about any particular passage, I could go hours on it from the standpoint of, the grammar to you name it. And this is, I see your approach to be more exegetical than eisegetical. You're not trying to read into something. You're taking what's there and dealing with it, and that's the thing that I really like about your method.
You can't start with morality out of the box. The problem is, these sort of package deal beliefs where you sign on the dotted line.
Right.
and you take on board all of your morality, and then you think, okay, I've got morality in my back pocket, and I don't have to exercise any moral reasoning. But I think that is one of the things that people want in a moral system. And it's not just, the religious who have this. People, will embrace a political ideology like Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism, for instance, is one that I think is rather thin, morally speaking. But they find it very, very satisfying because it's clean, it's tidy, it's simple. It has some very simple first principles, and everything's built out of that. And then it has an answer to virtually every question, and people are very satisfied with that. And so I think that there are moral systems out there, religious and philosophical and political, that are quick and dirty. But a lot of them tend to be divorced from the realities of human nature. They were invented, they were confected at a time when we didn't know as much as we do, and we have a position of relative advantage over the people who came up with those systems. We know more than they do. That doesn't make us better, but it puts us in an advantage that we should exploit. We should take advantage of what we know, and we shouldn't be afraid of saying, okay, well, I'm going to try to understand what morality is, and I'm not going to let anyone dictate to me that morality is this set of rules, for instance, and this is how you interpret the rules. That, I think, is so narrow and dangerous, really.
When it comes to that which is innate versus that which we acquire in the context of morality, could you speak to that, Ozzy?
What's innate and what's acquired? Well,
yeah, I mean, is there anything concerning morality that's innate and so on? And when it comes to moral acquisition, it's like when we talk about linguistics, we can talk about first, second, acquisitions that are very good models. That is an understanding linguistic modeling. Go for it.
Yeah, I can think of a few things. Okay, well, first of all, I think that the principle of reciprocity, of wanting to do good things for people who've been kind to you and have done you a favor, right? Reciprocity, so one hand washes the other, right? Just, one good turn deserves another. That, I think, is innate, right? I mean, we just automatically, all over the world, people just seem to feel favorably disposed to people who've been kind, right? So, reciprocity, mutualism, altruism, empathy, all of these things, I think, are innate. We all have them, right? And then there's this sort of xenophobic tendency, this mistrust of others, right? And then the sort of the disposition to trust people that you're closest to, closest to your kin, for instance, your own offspring, your mate, your parents, people immediately closest to you, right? We trust them. We're most favorably disposed to us. I think that's natural. And then we trust and like a little less, but still to a very significant degree, those in the broader community, right? So your more distant relative, your closest friends, for instance, and then your acquaintances, and then people who are just part of your community, perhaps only nominally, they're part of your country, for instance, so you feel a certain false, we talk about brotherhood and stuff like that, and your countrymen and stuff like that. You identify with people to a certain degree. But the idea is that the circle of your concern, the circle of your compassion is, it sort of fades as you go out. It's very, very strong and intense for people closest to you, and it fades as you go outwards, away from you. That, I think, is completely natural. So what's innate? So that's innate. But one of the things I think you can learn is you can realize, well, wait a minute. We live in a tribe of millions now. That doesn't suit us so well anymore. Really, what we ought to do is broaden the circle of our compassion. We ought to understand how those instincts serve us and how we can broaden the circle of our compassion to include everybody, right? Or as many people as possible, maybe even non-human species, other organisms, right? Outside of our own species. And the degree to which, we can even sort of discuss the degree to which we ought to feel empathy, right? In other words, things like empathy, altruism, compassion, these are things that may have an innate basis, but they can be cultivated, right? Just like your aesthetic sensibilities can be cultivated, right? Just like your rational faculties can be cultivated. Everyone has the capacity to reason, right? We're all born with a reasoning capacity. We're not born with it, but we very quickly acquire a capacity to reason. But we can also learn, we can be taught to reason explicitly. It's almost the difference between learning a spoken language and becoming very, very articulate, and then learning how to read and write, which is completely unnatural, that has to be taught, right? You have to take children, you have to put them in a classroom, you have to make them sit for unnaturally long periods of time, not moving, looking at a blackboard or a whiteboard with artifacts, and teach them painstakingly to read and write, to write out letters and stuff like that. And I think that moral instruction is like that. Parents do it quite naturally, like, how would you like it if Johnny did that to you? And say please and thank you. And we teach all these things, right? But I think that morality, that there's more to it than that. You can go beyond that, just like you can go beyond learning how to speak. You can go on to read and write, and you can even become a great artist. And I think that there are people in the world, I'm not among them, but there are people in the world who I think are effectively moral geniuses. And we have much to learn from them. And the question is, will we recognize them when they come along?
That was excellent. I spent a lifetime, it seems, decades, that is, studying the Torah, the prophets, the writings, the Jesus narrative from so many different angles, through so many different kinds of hermeneutics. This did improve my life to a certain degree, and yet I can see lots and lots of negatives at the same time. So the question would be to you, Ozzy, how can I become a better person? How can I acquire a better moral understanding today? I want to be so much better than I am now. How does that take place?
I don't know that you're asking the right person.
Come on, talk to me.
I'm someone who's interested in
improve me, Ozzy.
I don't know that I can. I'm someone who's interested in moral questions and the nature of morality. I think as a philosophical question, it's fascinating. And of course, like everybody else, I have a vested interest in understanding morality and being a good person. Practically everyone thinks that they're doing the best that they can, right? No matter how rotten a job they're doing, everyone thinks that they're doing okay. Or at least has a reason why they think that an exception needed to be made in the case that they did something horrible or something like that. So the fact that I'm interested in this philosophical subject shouldn't be understood by anyone to imply that I think that because I have studied this a bit, that this puts me in a better moral position than anybody else. I mean, it's an embarrassing fact, that you can study morality and moral philosophies your whole life, and it doesn't make you a more moral person. Because I don't think the motivation or the capacity to be more moral stems from having, surveyed the landscape of different moral philosophies. I don't think it works that way. You can study, human kinetics and physiology your whole life, but it's not going to make you a better hockey player. Right, you got to get out there and you got to play hockey, and so I don't have any advice. I have no good practical advice to give anyone on how to be a moral person, except to do this. Just try to think about the predictable consequences of your actions, right, on the well-being of other people. Think in terms of harm and well-being, right? And there are all these things that we've all been told by our mothers, put yourself in the other person's shoes, right?
Yeah.
And things like that, right? Look at the beam in your own eye before you point out a speck in the other. I mean, all of this is all about getting yourself to leap out of the barrier of yourself, right, and into another person. Why? Because what morality is about how to live with other people, right? And the moral discourse wouldn't arise if we all lived on our own separate planets and we couldn't interact with one another, right? Or if you were the only person alive, right? Moral questions really wouldn't arise, right? The questions arise because we live with other people, and what's relevant about other people is that there's something that it's like to be them. So really what you have to do is exercise your imaginative faculties. One of the things, if I had one practical tip, it would be this: read good literature and watch really good films that present characters very realistically with rich inner lives, that afford you some insight into their inner lives, that makes you feel for them. And that, I think, works. I mean, I was once asked, who's the greatest psychologist? I used to be a psychology student. I was once asked, who's the greatest psychologist in the world? And I said without hesitation, George Eliot, right? This fantastic 19th century female writer. She went by a pseudonym, George Eliot. She wrote a number of great English masterpieces, one of which is called Middlemarch, right? And when I read that book, I remember thinking I would be terrified to meet this woman, because this woman understands the human psyche so well that if I were to talk to her, and if there were any artifice in me, she would see through it like a laser. I would feel raw and exposed. I would be humiliated, right? Great art, great literature, great film and theater, I think, has the ability to put you into situations, put you into the soul of another person that you could never do through your own exercise of imagination. So, I mean, that would be it. Just try to put yourself in the mind of another person. And it's often impossible to do that through the exercise of your own imagination. And I think art is the next best thing that we've got. In fact, it's even better than the exercise of your own imagination, because you're not limited to your own narrow first-person experience. You get the benefit of the experience of other people.
That touched me. I mean, I can see in your eyes when you were sharing this. I mean, you really care. You really care about humanity. You really want to see people improving their lives. Am I wrong?
No, you're not wrong. I mean, I care about humanity. I've reached an age now. It's really funny. I've crossed the threshold past 50 now. And one of the things that happens when you feel that you are sort of closer to the end than you are at the beginning, you're filled with a greater sense of tragedy. It's tragic events in people's lives. When I hear that some young person has undertaken a decision or a course in their life that's got them on rails to some disastrous outcome, and you see it, you know that it's going to unfold badly for them and stuff like that. When you hear about these sorts of things, I get choked up, and I cry more easily and stuff like that. I'm more mushy than I ever used to be. And it's simply because as you get older, you realize I only get one kick at the can. I don't get to come back, and I don't get a do-over. And it means something to me that people are going to not live fantastic lives. I wish I had lived a better life than I had. And I wish, I mean, there's, if you could go back and give yourself advice and you could convince yourself to listen to the things that you would say. Yeah. And there are a lot of young people in my life. I'm involved in certain activities where there's a lot of young people, and I feel I'm overflowing with kind of avuncular impulses where I want to take them aside and coach them, and I'm in no position to do anything of the sort. But yeah, I care. And I think we care more as we get older. And I think it's particularly pronounced for me. That is, I'm noticing it more in myself because I didn't have kids. When you have kids, you have skin in the game in a way that someone who's childless like me doesn't, right? So for me, this is something that has kind of caught me off guard late in life, right? And I'm sort of filled with a sense of tragedy when I see, oh shoot, life could be so much better. We could all just do so much better by being less selfish and less self-interested and so forth. So good movies and good books. That's what I would recommend. Good theater.
Wow. That's rich. What inspires and fulfills Ozzy?
Oh dear. I don't know how much it has to do with morality. It's rather orthogonal. I love the outdoors. I love nature. I love camping. I love canoeing. I love practicing bushcraft and hiking and snowshoeing, and that really moves me. I like being out there doing, practicing dirt time. Like paws in the dirt, and that really does a lot for me. I find that incredibly restorative. I feel like I'm sort of in touch with my ancestors, and I feel sort of connected to living things, and it's as close as I ever get to a spiritual or religious experience, but it's pretty profound. I don't know what part it plays in moral reasoning, except to say that I feel like the circle of my concern and compassion grows when I'm out in the natural world, when I'm away from all the artifice and cell phones and cars and streets and all of that, when I'm just in the Canadian bush, or trudging across snow or something like that and building a snow shelter, or something like that, starting a fire by primitive means. That, I don't know, it's a weird thing. It's idiosyncratic, but it does a lot for me. That really inspires me. It restores me. And, when I go back and back in town with friends and family, I feel like a different person. I feel like a better person. But that's just me. I don't know that I would recommend that to everyone. I mean, I do recommend it to everyone, but I don't, not for moral reasons.
Well, I have to say this, the people here at NCG, we resonate with Ozzy. And so please know that, and we love you so much.